It was the summer of 1878, late afternoon, and the Arizona sun hung low, burning the horizon into shades of blood and gold. The wind tore across the dry prairie, carrying grit and the distant scent of creosote, rattling the boards of the lone homestead perched atop a jagged ridge. Dust devils twisted and danced over the parched earth, and the silhouettes of mesquite trees swayed like ghosts under the blazing sky. John Calhoun, a weathered rancher with sun-scorched skin and hands scarred from decades of toil, sat astride his bay mare, scanning the emptiness around him. His wide-brimmed hat shadowed eyes that had long grown accustomed to solitude, and the corners of his mouth were set in a permanent line of quiet endurance. His ranch stretched for miles, a patchwork of fencing and corrals, yet in all that space, only the howling wind kept him company. A sudden, piercing cry shattered the monotony, a sound so desperate and raw it cut through the prairie like a knife. Calhoun's hand went to the butt of his revolver instinctively as he spurred the horse toward the noise. Behind a ridge, tangled among thorny brush, a small figure emerged. A girl, no older than 12 or 13, with dirt-streaked cheeks and wide, terrified eyes. Her hair, dark as raven feathers, clung to her sweat-slicked face, and her slender frame trembled from exhaustion. Something had gone terribly wrong. The girl's cries twisted into a sob as she stumbled, and Calhoun saw the ragged remnants of a torn dress and a rope scar across her wrist. The reality hit him with a shock. She wasn't just lost. She had been hunted, abandoned, or worse. The silence of the desert pressed in, heavy and suffocating, and for the first time in years, Calhoun felt a tether pull at his conscience, demanding action he hadn't asked for. As he dismounted, dust clinging to his boots and the sun searing his back, he realized that his quiet life of solitude was over. The land he had poured every coin and sweat-soaked hour into was about to become the stage for a story far larger than his own. But before we continue, make sure to like and subscribe for more untold Wild West stories. The next morning, the desert sun rose sluggishly over the jagged horizon, painting the prairie in pale gold and stretching long, angular shadows across the dry earth. John Calhoun stood on the wooden porch of his farmhouse, arms crossed, eyes tracing the distant ridges where the girl had vanished into the night before. She hadn't run far. Exhaustion had pinned her to the creek bed near the corral, where he had left her wrapped in an old blanket. Yet the weight of responsibility settled like a stone in his chest, heavier than any sack of grain he had ever lifted. He hadn't asked for this. A man could spend decades carving a life from the wilderness, and still, the world could thrust an obligation upon him that no amount of coin or courage could escape. But here she was, trembling and silent in the morning heat, and the memory of her tear-streaked face haunted him. There was no turning away. The girl's presence demanded action, demanded protection, and John knew the Apache would come searching. He could not, and would not, let them find her harmed. The girl stirred at the sound of his boots crunching over the gravel. Her eyes, wide and wary, met his, and for a fleeting moment, the prairie seemed to hold its breath. She didn't speak. The only sounds were the whispering wind through the mesquite and the distant lowing of cattle. John knelt slowly, keeping his movements deliberate and unthreatening, his fingers brushing dust from his coat. "You're safe now," he said, voice gravelly, yet firm. He offered her a hand. Hesitation froze her for a heartbeat. Then she allowed him to help her to her feet. Her frame was smaller than he had thought, almost fragile against the broad canvas of the morning light. Weeks passed, and the ranch transformed into a cage of duty. The girl, whom John learned was named Ayanna, spoke little, but her presence demanded routine. Meals to be prepared, chores explained, and lessons in survival passed down from a man who had never raised a child. Every day, John's solitude eroded further, replaced by the inescapable reality of responsibility. He could feel the prickle of judgment from his neighbors, but it was the weight of the girl's dependency that carved the deepest lines into his thoughts. A letter arrived one evening, sealed in crude handwriting, the paper rough and edges singed by desert heat. It was from the Apache. They demanded their daughter be returned, warning of consequences should she remain with an outsider. John sat by the fireplace, the flickering flames casting angular shadows across the walls, and read the words repeatedly, as if repetition could soften their threat. He was alone, outnumbered, and yet the thought of sending her back, of exposing her to the dangers she had already narrowly escaped, was unthinkable. The next morning, he led Ayanna into the fields, sweat glistening on his forehead as the sun climbed higher, and he taught her to saddle the mare. Her hands were small, her movements clumsy, but determination lit her eyes. As she climbed onto the horse, she wobbled, and he steadied her, fingers pressing against hers. The connection was silent, but binding. In that moment, he realized that the path before him was no longer one of choice. It was a path carved by circumstance, by morality, and by a desert that demanded courage from those who lived upon it. The days blended into each other, feeding cattle at dawn, checking fences under the scorching sun, preparing meals for two, and listening to the soft whisper of the wind through the high grass. Each task, mundane in appearance, was now a tether to Ayanna's safety and his own conscience. The Apache warnings lingered in the corners of his mind, a storm cloud threatening to break at any moment. Yet he pressed on, forging routines that bound them together in a fragile rhythm of survival. One evening, as the sun sank behind the mountains, painting the sky in bruised purples and reds, Ayanna finally spoke. Her voice, small but clear, broke the tension that had clung to the homestead like dust. "You will not let them take me back?" she asked. John's throat tightened. He could feel the truth of his promise, the weight of his answer binding him irrevocably to a path he had never chosen but could not abandon. Outside, the desert stretched endlessly, indifferent to the struggles of one man and one child. Yet within that unforgiving land, a new bond had been forged, a forced path neither could escape, yet one that promised endurance and perhaps survival. The first step had been taken, and the frontier had already begun shaping the destinies of both John and Ayanna. The town of Red Mesa sat like a stubborn blister on the edge of the desert, its streets dusty, its wooden buildings warped and sun-bleached. Summer lingered heavily, the air shimmering with heat and dust, carrying the faint stench of horses, sweat, and smoke from distant homesteads. John Calhoun rode into town one morning, Ayanna perched awkwardly behind him on the mare, her small hands gripping his waist as they approached the saloon. His arrival did not pass unnoticed. The townsfolk gathered in whispers at the edges of the boardwalk, hats tilted, eyes sharp. Children peeked from doorways, mothers clutched shawls around their shoulders, and men leaned against fence posts with arms crossed, lips twitching into skeptical grins. Rumors had already traveled faster than his horse. A rancher taking in an Apache girl was a story that ignited curiosity, suspicion, and, for some, downright anger. "John Calhoun, you lost your mind?" A man spat from across the street, voice rough and mocking. "Taking in her kind? What next? Marrying her off to the coyote?" Laughter followed, sharp and cruel, cutting through the heavy air. John's jaw tightened, the sun glinting off his revolver at his hip, though he made no move to draw. He dismounted slowly, keeping Ayanna close, letting his presence speak of calm authority rather than temper. Ayanna shrank slightly at the taunts, her eyes darting from one sneering face to another. John put a hand on her shoulder, a grounding touch that spoke louder than words. He knew the girl was not safe from prejudice, even here in the relative security of his own town. The murmurs and pointed fingers were only the beginning. Deeper, more dangerous tensions lay beneath the surface, waiting for a misstep. Over the following weeks, the hostility only grew. Local ranchers refused to trade with him, merchants haggled harder, and whispers turned to direct confrontation. A stranger's gaze lingered too long on Ayanna. An angry cattleman blocked him at the corral, demanding the girl be sent back to her people. John had to mediate, calm, and sometimes threaten, all while keeping Ayanna's fragile trust intact. Each encounter was a test, each word measured and deliberate, like walking a knife's edge under the unrelenting desert sun. One evening, a group of men rode up to the ranch, hooves kicking clouds of dust, faces obscured by bandanas. They demanded he return the girl, their tone threaded with threat. "You think this land can shield you?" one growled. The wind howled through the corral, rattling the wooden posts like a warning drum. John met their gaze steadily, hand resting lightly on the revolver. He did not flinch. "She stays," he said, voice calm but carrying the weight of inevitability. The standoff stretched, tense as a drawn bow, until the men, frustrated but wary of provoking bloodshed, spurred their horses and rode off, leaving dust in their wake. Inside the farmhouse that night, John paced the floorboards, the dim lamplight flickering across his face, while Ayanna sat quietly by the fireplace, small shoulders hunched. The isolation of the ranch felt sharper than ever, the desert around them suddenly a suffocating cage. Yet in the quiet, there was understanding and unspoken acknowledgement that the world would not bend to their will, and they must forge their own path through the hostility. The community's scorn was relentless, but it had inadvertently forged resilience. John grew harder, sharper, learning to anticipate prejudice and meet it without surrender. Ayanna, too, began to steel herself, glancing up from chores with quiet determination. Together, they navigated the subtle dangers of distrust, whispers, and veiled threats, their small victories echoing across the dry land like defiant drumbeats. The sun sank behind the ridges, burning the sky into streaks of amber and violet, and for a moment, the harshness of Red Mesa seemed to pause, as if the desert itself watched. John and Ayanna stood side by side on the porch, the wind tossing their hair, the weight of the town's disapproval heavy but bearable. The path forward was uncertain, littered with tension, danger, and suspicion, but it was theirs to walk. And walk it they would, come dust storms, threats, or scorn. The desert morning was brittle with the sharp scent of sagebrush and sun-baked earth. Wind scuttled across the prairie, lifting loose dust in tiny whirlwinds that danced across the corral. John Calhoun worked steadily, his broad hands gripping the reins as he led the horses through their morning exercise, while Ayanna followed behind, learning to mimic the motions with tentative precision. Her small frame wobbled atop the mare, but each day she grew steadier, her confidence inching forward like a cautious sunrise over the jagged horizon. Inside the farmhouse, the air carried the comforting aroma of fresh bread and coffee, a rare softness in the harsh world outside. John sat across from her at the worn wooden table, watching as she carefully smeared butter over warm biscuits. For a long moment, they said nothing, the quiet between them not empty but full of trust, slowly building, of past traumas lingering like shadows in corners, and of the unspoken understanding that each depended on the other. It began with small gestures. John taught her how to milk the cow without startling it, guiding her hands with patience that surprised even him. Ayanna, in turn, showed him how she could track tiny footprints across the sand, pointing out details in the land that he, despite decades on the prairie, had never noticed. In these exchanges, the rigid barrier of guardian and ward softened into partnership. Trust sprouted, delicate as a desert flower, yet stubborn and resilient. One evening, the sky bruised with twilight, they sat together by the fire. Ayanna finally spoke of her past, her voice low and trembling like the wind rustling through the mesquite. She spoke of her family, the raid that had torn her from them, the loneliness and fear that had followed. Her words spilled like water over sun-cracked soil, raw and unfiltered. John listened, the firelight flickering across his rugged features, his expression gentle but steady. He shared pieces of his own solitude, the years of isolation, the loss of his wife, the way loneliness had become both companion and burden. Through these stories, the air in the farmhouse shifted. Laughter began to break through, brittle at first, then warmer, richer. Ayanna's first hesitant smiles, the soft tilt of her head as she asked a question, the small hand she placed over his during chores, all became silent affirmations of their growing bond. In the quiet of the desert night, with coyotes calling in the distance, and stars pricking the sky with cold fire, a shared strength took root. They were no longer two solitary figures against the vast prairie, they were a small, unbreakable unit. The wind howled one afternoon, kicking up sand and rattling the wooden slats of the corral, yet they moved through the chores with steady rhythm, communicating in glances and gestures. When a fence post collapsed under the strain of a restless horse, John caught Ayanna before she stumbled, holding her close as she gasped. The incident, small in scope, but monumental in its intimacy, solidified a trust that neither words nor time alone could forge. In quiet moments, John noticed the resilience in her gaze, the way she straightened her back when lifting buckets of water, the subtle confidence in the way she handled the horses. She had begun to mirror his determination, absorbing not only the skills needed to survive on the prairie, but the quiet courage to face a world that had already tried to break her. As dusk descended, the horizon bleeding into shades of deep purple and gold, they stood side by side at the edge of the corral. Ayanna brushed dust from her sleeves, eyes reflecting the last light, and John felt a flicker of something he hadn't allowed himself in years' hope. The wind whispered through the tall grass, carrying the scent of distant rain and distant danger, yet in that moment there was peace, a fragile yet undeniable strength that had taken root between them. The desert remained harsh, the prairie unforgiving, but together they had begun to forge a quiet sanctuary. It was in the small acts, the shared labors, and the vulnerable confessions that the real resilience grew, a resilience that would be tested in ways neither of them could yet foresee. The sky that morning was a restless gray, clouds roiling over the jagged ridges like an angry sea frozen above the desert. A cold wind tore across the prairie, whipping loose dust and dried grass into frantic spirals, rattling the farmhouse and corral alike. John Calhoun tightened his coat against the chill, eyes scanning the horizon with a hunter's vigilance, knowing instinctively that this storm, both in weather and fate, would not pass quietly. Ayanna clung to his side, her small hand gripping his sleeve as they rode toward the northern pasture. The wind bit at her cheeks, but the fire in her eyes, hardened by weeks of survival and trust, met John's steady gaze. They reached the fence lines to find chaos. A stampede of cattle surged through the corral, kicked into panic by the storm and the distant rumble of approaching hooves. One of the horses broke free, galloping toward the ridge, and a sudden scream carried over the wind Ayanna's voice, sharp and fearful. Raiders, a band of men, tipped in shadow and cruelty, emerged from the dust like specters, cutting off the northern exit. Their intent was clear. The Apache girl was to be taken, and no one would stand in their way. John's hand hovered over his revolver, the familiar weight grounding him, while adrenaline flared through every muscle. Ayanna's small frame crouched against him, eyes wide with terror, yet he could see the spark of courage she had cultivated, the same courage that had pulled her through days of loneliness, ridicule, and hardship. The confrontation escalated in heartbeats. Gunfire cracked across the prairie, echoing against the distant mountains, mingling with the shrill cries of panicked cattle. Dust clouded the air, stinging eyes and filling mouths with grit, as John dodged and returned fire, his aim steady despite the chaos. Ayanna, trembling yet determined, managed to help corral a small group of calves into safety, her small hands guided by the lessons he had painstakingly taught. Each moment stretched into eternity, the air thick with smoke, sand, and the smell of gunpowder. Suddenly, one of the raiders lunged toward the farmhouse, torch in hand. Flames licked the wooden siding, hungry and swift, threatening the home John had built with years of sweat. He threw himself forward, tackling the man to the ground, wrestling for control, while the fire spread with terrifying speed. Ayanna screamed, and John's heart seized. The girl's safety was never more uncertain. He forced the raider back, grabbing Ayanna and hauling her into the barn as the roof groaned under the heat and wind. The storm intensified, a mixture of wind, fire, and human malice colliding over the ridge. John fought with every ounce of strength, every practiced movement honed from decades on the prairie. But fatigue and fury collided. He was struck in the shoulder, the sharp pain sending him to one knee. The raiders pressed in, ruthless and relentless. Ayanna's hand found his, holding on tightly, and he felt the bond between them crystallize in the crucible of danger. Through a combination of grit, luck, and instinct, John managed to push the attackers back long enough to herd Ayanna to the hidden creek bed where she had first appeared weeks before. The fire consumed part of the farmhouse, the wind carrying smoke and ash across the prairie, but for a fleeting moment, the world fell silent around them. The raiders had withdrawn, but the victory was hollow. The land bore the scars of conflict, and John's shoulder throbbed with the sting of blood and grit. As twilight bled into night, John and Ayanna stood together on the ridge, watching the blackened smoke curl toward the horizon. Their breaths came ragged, hearts pounding in tandem, and the vast desert stretched endlessly around them, indifferent to their suffering, indifferent to their survival. Yet amid the ruin, the girl's small hand in his, there was a resolute pulse of defiance, a promise that neither storm, fire, nor human cruelty could extinguish. The prairie had tested them, breaking bones, scattering herds, and scorching land, but it had also tempered them. The night settled in, cold and vast, carrying with it the weight of lessons learned. Courage could be forged in chaos, bonds could be solidified in fear, and the frontier would always demand more than one man or child could bear alone, but together they might endure. The fire had burned itself out, leaving only blackened timbers and the acrid scent of smoke lingering in the morning air. The prairie wind whispered across the scorched fields, carrying with it the quiet aftermath of a battle fought and barely won. John Calhoun stood at the edge of what had once been his farmhouse, shoulders still aching from the raiders' blows, eyes tracing the horizon where the first hint of sunrise gilded the distant ridges. Ayanna sat beside him, knees pulled close, her small hand resting lightly over his. The gesture was simple, almost imperceptible to the untrained eye. Yet it spoke volumes: trust, survival, and an unspoken promise that neither would face the wilderness alone again. Smoke curled lazily from the remains of the barn, now just a skeletal frame against the burning gold of morning. Yet amidst the ruin, life stubbornly persisted. Birds circled overhead, singing their cautious hymns to the new day, and a lone horse grazed near the creek where Ayanna had first appeared weeks before. The prairie, harsh and indifferent as ever, seemed to exhale, acknowledging the small victory of endurance, even as scars remained etched into its surface. John surveyed the damage, feeling the weight of responsibility heavier than ever. But within that weight lay a determination that had taken root in the months since the attack. With Ayanna's guidance, the repairs began. Every nail driven into charred beams, every board replaced in the farmhouse walls, was a testament not only to labor but to resilience. And in those labors, a quiet ritual emerged. John would carve the date of the fire into a sturdy beam, and beneath it, Ayanna etched her own initials. Together, they marked their survival, a permanent reminder that no storm, literal or human, could erase what they had endured. The first hints of spring brought new life to the prairie. The fields, once trampled and scorched, were tilled and seeded, the earth soft beneath calloused hands. Corn sprouted green and strong, and cattle grazed along the rebuilt fences, oblivious to the violence that had scarred their past. John watched Ayanna lead the horses through the morning light, her silhouette small yet unyielding against the rising sun, and felt an unfamiliar warmth in his chest. Pride, yes, but also something deeper, a budding recognition of the bond that had grown between them, forged in fire, fear, and the relentless march of the frontier. By the end of the year, the ranch had transformed. The farmhouse gleamed with fresh paint, windows catching the sunlight like watchful eyes, and the corral rang with the lively rhythm of daily chores. The town of Red Mesa, once wary and skeptical, began to shift. Merchants offered fair trades. Neighbors greeted him with cautious nods, and a few even lingered, asking about the girl who had changed the reclusive rancher's life. Respect, begrudging at first, bloomed into acceptance. It was a subtle triumph, one earned not with gunfire, but with steadfastness and quiet courage. One evening, as twilight settled across the ridges, John and Ayanna sat by the fire outside the new farmhouse. The flames danced, casting shadows that flickered like memories across their faces. John reached into his coat pocket and drew out a simple silver necklace, a keepsake he had carried since, before the prairie had claimed his solitude. He fastened it gently around Ayanna's neck, the silver catching the dying light. She smiled, her teeth catching the glow, and whispered a word he had grown to love: "Thank you." It was not a single act of gratitude. It was acknowledgement, trust, and the unspoken bond of family, forged in dust, blood, and shared survival. Months later, a letter arrived from the Apache, this time without threat, only acknowledgement. They recognized the care John had provided, the bond formed, and the respect he had shown their daughter. Though the girl remained with him, their connection to her people was no longer one of fear or obligation, but mutual respect. John felt the burden of the past months lighten, replaced by a sense of justice honored, and a life reclaimed from the chaos that had threatened to swallow it. On a warm summer evening, the prairie glowed under the horizon's fire-colored light. John and Ayanna walked along the ridge, hands intertwined, each step a testament to endurance and the subtle beauty of everyday moments reclaimed from hardship. The ranch behind them hummed with life, the creak of gates, the lowing of cattle, and the soft murmur of wind through mesquite trees composing a quiet symphony of survival and hope. In the stillness, John paused, letting the wind tousle Ayanna's hair. "We made it," he said softly, not as a boast but as acknowledgement of the journey, the forced path, the battles fought against scorn and danger, and the quiet strength they had nurtured together. Ayanna's hand squeezed his, a simple gesture, yet it carried the weight of all they had endured and all they would face together. The prairie stretched endlessly, a landscape of dust, light, and shadow, indifferent yet endlessly forgiving to those who dared to endure. John and Ayanna, forged by trials and tempered in fire, had found not only survival but a measure of peace, a sanctuary amidst the untamed expanse of the Wild West. Names carved into wood, silver catching sunlight, and fires glowing in the dusk were more than symbols. They were proof that courage, compassion, and resilience could prevail, even in a world defined by hardship. As the sun sank behind the distant mountains, spilling molten light across the horizon, John and Ayanna stood side by side, gazing out across the land they had fought to protect. Their journey was far from over, but the past year had proven that endurance, trust, and love could carve meaning from even the harshest desert. And for those who ride the untamed trails of the West, that lesson was worth more than gold. If this story touched your heart, ride with us again across the untold trails of the Wild West. Don't forget to subscribe to keep the fire of these stories alive.